It is time for us to begin our Bible class. We're in chapter 18 of the book of Acts. We got ready early today, and it threw my schedule off so much I forgot to put my hearing aids in and forgot to put a watch on. But I have a brother assigned to stop me at the right time, to wave me down. Acts chapter 18. You remember in chapter 17, Paul was at Athens. We finished, he was on Mars Hill, the Areopagus, and he was discussing philosophy with the Epicureans and the Stoics, two schools of philosophy in Greek culture. See if you guys remember. Do you remember what the Stoic philosophers were about? Anybody remember? Epicureans, Stoics. The Stoics said that the flesh was evil and that you couldn't control it. You don't worry about the flesh; it's evil anyway. Just go on and do whatever you want to do. The Epicureans, I got it backwards. The Stoics said you had to control the flesh. And so they would fast, and they wouldn't eat meat, and they would sometimes beat their own bodies in order to discipline themselves. Paul said over in 1 Corinthians 9, about verse 27, I buffet my body daily, lest after preaching to others, I myself be shipwrecked. He was talking about disciplining himself. That was a Stoic philosophy. Epicureans were the ones who said, eat, drink, and be merry. It's just the flesh anyway, and it doesn't matter what you do in the flesh as long as your heart's in the right place. Those people seem to be in charge of our culture right now. The Epicurean philosophy seems to be winning in America right now. That just says, do whatever you want to do. If it feels good, do it. And don't worry about it. Just be spiritual. Get you some crystals. Maybe believe in angels, that'd be good. Get you a bumper sticker with a rainbow on it, and everything will be fine. Well, neither one of those are biblical positions. The truth of the matter is that God created the flesh, and He does expect us to lead it to obedience, but it's not an evil thing. The flesh is not an evil thing. We have God-given blessings of the flesh. I mean, I got to tell you, one of the reasons my voice is struggling is I walked by the donut shop and got 1/3 of a blueberry donut. I'm allergic to flour. I'm not supposed to eat blueberry donuts, but man, it tasted good. Just that much of a donut, now I can't talk. Well, God gave us taste buds that can tell the difference between a blueberry donut and a chocolate donut. And it's good. God created it, and it's good. We don't have to deny the flesh. We do have to control the flesh and bring it into obedience. We have to use our flesh for God's glory. We're not allowed to just turn it loose and do whatever the flesh desires. Because every time in human history that man has cut loose from God and just done whatever he wanted to do, it was a mess. Every single time. When we're cut loose from our God-given blessings and responsibilities, we end up in a bad place. It ends up sensual and violent and takes advantage of the weak and the poor and is not pleasing to God. And so these two schools of philosophy are there, and Paul is holding his own in Athens, the headquarters of Greek philosophy. Paul's arguing philosophy and doing quite well with it. There are some who are really interested in what he has to say. And there are others that say, when he got to the part about a bodily resurrection of the dead, they shut him off. Now, because they had this concept of the flesh is wicked. And the idea that the flesh would be resurrected once you finally get away from it, was foreign to them. And so, after these things, verse 18, chapter 18, verse 1, after these things, Paul departed from Athens and went to Corinth, and he found a certain Jew named Aquila, born in Pontus, who had recently come from Italy with his wife Priscilla, because Claudius had commanded all the Jews to depart from Rome, and he came to them. So because he was of the same trade, he stayed with them and worked, for by occupation they were tent makers. And he reasoned in the synagogue every Sabbath and persuaded both Jews and Greeks. So he left Athens and went to Corinth. Corinth was a very busy city. It was a port city. There were actually two ports in Achaia. There was Cenchrea, which was on this side of the country, and Corinth on this side of the country. And because the waters around Achaia were filled with rocks and reefs and currents, it was dangerous. They actually had a system set up where they would take smaller ships and roll them on logs from Cenchrea over to Corinth and put them back in the water on the other side. And the bigger ships, they would unload and transport the cargo by sled, and sometimes slave labor and sometimes with donkeys, would then load the ships back up. And the reason they did that was because there were a lot of shipwrecks around the southern edge of the peninsula of Achaia. Greece was divided into two states: Macedonia in the north, that's where Philippi was, and Thessalonica and Berea, and Achaia in the south, where there was Corinth and Cenchrea. There were a lot of sailors. It was a double port city. So there were a lot of sailors in the area. And when sailors get off the ship and get on land, they don't usually look for a Bible study. Am I right? Yeah, that's not what they're looking for. When they've been on a ship for a while and they get on land again, they're looking for wine, women, and song, and not necessarily the song. And that's what Corinth was. And it was a very idolatrous place. Now, in Athens, you have what they call the highbrow gods: Zeus, Apollos, Hermes, those gods. Down in Cenchrea, they were what you would call the base gods. Aphrodite, the goddess of fertility. Asclepius, the god of healing. Aphrodite, you worshipped her by going and paying your fee, and you slept with one of the temple priestesses. So you committed fornication as an act of worship. Asclepius, if you were sick, you could go pay a fee, and you sleep in the temple, and they would turn snakes loose in the temple. And if a snake crawled over you, you would be healed. Well, I guarantee you, if a snake crawls over me, I'm going to be healed. I'm going to be making tracks to get out of that place. But it was all sort of dark and ungodly and wicked. And so it's a different culture. You know, Athens was a different culture than Ephesus, and Corinth. Well, if you want to call somebody a bad moral person, you call him a Corinthian. If a guy was just a low-life, scallywag, stealing, cheating bum, you called him a Corinthian. That's the city he went to. And yet, that's where the gospel, in all of Paul's travels, the gospel was very powerful in Corinth. Many people, a few people everywhere he went, a few people accepted the gospel. But in Corinth, he had a powerful work. He stayed there 18 months. And he converted many to Christ, Jews and Gentiles. He converted them to Christ because light shines brightest in the darkness. And I have found that to be true. There are cultures in our world today where the gospel doesn't get much of a listening. Been to Scotland, most beautiful country on the planet Earth. If it hadn't been for Scotch whiskey, the Scottish people would rule the world. They basically created the Industrial Revolution. You start going through the list of things invented by Scottish people, it'll blow your mind. All of the things they came up with. And yet now, and by the way, they were one of the first great missionary nations of the British Empire. Scottish missionaries took the gospel to India and China, all over Asia, way before anybody else did. However, right now in Scotland, the churches are empty. They're empty. They might have a dozen people show up for a service in a building that seats 500. The gospel is not being heard easily in Scotland. There are some. There are some that are hearing and obeying the gospel. It's happening some. And then we go to India, and you can preach the gospel 3 or 4 times a day there if you have the strength. And they're obeying the gospel so fast, we have no idea how many congregations there are, how many Christians there are, how many preachers there are. We have no idea. It's growing so fast, no one can even measure it. And because the timing is right. The time is right. God put people there at just the right time for the gospel to be heard. It's becoming harder in America for the gospel to be heard. They just don't want to hear it. Like Marcelino's sermon, they don't want to see the glory of Christ. They don't want to see it right now. It's interesting, whenever we get in trouble, whenever we get attacked, or the economy goes bad and things get hard, all of a sudden people want to pray. All of a sudden people want to know Christ. All of a sudden the Congress meets on the steps of the Senate and they have a prayer session when things are rough. But we have been so richly blessed, we have been so prospered by God that people have forgotten where it came from. Remember the prayer, the prayer, I can't remember now, it must be in the Proverbs, that said, Lord, bless me with enough food to eat so that I won't be hungry and curse you. But don't bless me with so much that I become prosperous and forget you. There's a wise prayer there. The gospel was accepted well in Corinth. One of the reasons is that people that are truly lost, that are far from God, they have no hope. They have no hope. You know, if you're, and this was a struggle I had. I thought I was a pretty good guy. I graduated from high school with a solid B average. Well, B minus average. I was an Eagle Scout. I thought I was a pretty good guy until I started reading the Bible. And I realized there were some things that needed to be repented of. And that God called for a higher standard. Well, that was better than the next guy. Yeah, well, the next guy was lost too. All right? But people who truly have been lost, they have no hope. Christ is their only hope. And when they see that, they grab hold of Christ because they know that they were lost and they didn't have any hope. And it wasn't a matter that they needed to reform a few of their bad habits. They needed to come to repentance, and they knew it. And they grab hold of Jesus hard. And they start bringing everybody they know to Jesus. That's what was going on in Corinth. Interesting, it says that when Paul got there, Aquila and Priscilla were there because Claudius, he was the emperor at the time, had commanded all of the Jews to leave Rome. Claudius, emperor, it's interesting when you read Luke and Acts, you know, he says, during the reign of Augustus Caesar, during the first census, you can date it You know who's in political power? It's never once upon a time in a land far, far away. It's always, while Claudius was emperor of Rome, Paul went to Corinth because we know when it was, because Claudius kicked all the Jews out in 51 AD. It's part of history. Suetonius wrote, he was a Roman historian, that in 51 AD, Claudius expelled all of the Jews from Rome because they kept having these arguments about some Christus guy, some guy they called Christ. All the synagogues were all stirred up, and he just kicked them all out. He was sick of them arguing. Didn't believe in their God anyway, and it was just too much trouble. He said, y'all leave. And because of that, Aquila and Priscilla went to Corinth, where they were practicing their profession, which was tent making. They made tents. And since Paul was also of that profession, he joined with them. He worked in their business for a while until Paul and Timothy came down. Paul had left Timothy and Silas. Thank you. Paul had left Timothy and Silas back in Berea. And when they came down, the Scripture says Paul devoted himself to the preaching of the Word. He was free. He was free then to devote himself to the preaching of the Word, partially because they probably brought a gift with them financially so that he didn't have to make tents to eat, which is a wonderful blessing. Paul wrote to the church in Philippi and said, you've been my partners in the gospel from the very beginning. From the first, you have taken care of my needs again and again. They partnered with him in the gospel. There are benefits of both. I have done both. The first 30 years of my preaching career, I was a full-time minister. I drew a salary. And I was able to spend and devote myself to the Word. And one of the things I missed from that is the time that I had to study. I had time to research things deeply, and I could go get all the dates and the history and put it all together. And I was able to do that for a number of years, and it was a great blessing. I don't have time anymore for that like I used to, and I miss that. There's a blessing also that comes from making tents. The last part of my preaching career, and now I work a job. And there's some blessing in it. Number one, the business world appreciates their workers financially better than churches do. I looked up about age 55 and said, boy, you're in a heap of trouble. You don't own a home because you've been living in a parsonage. You don't have Social Security because you haven't been paying it. You don't have any money. You're in a world of hurt. And so I went and got a job. And God has been very, very kind. I didn't know if I would ever be able to retire, and I certainly didn't know how God was going to pull it off, but He has. And so there's some blessings that come from it. The second blessing is God put me in the workplace where there were a lot of people, and people who were hurting and in need. And I'd had 35 years of training how to minister to people who are hurting and in need. And I would say that I've probably converted more people to Christ after I got out of the ministry and went into the workplace. Because people don't like preachers. You know, you don't invite them over to watch the football game with you because you might slip and say something and then they'd preach about it. Yeah. So God works. Paul made tents. Why? Because he needed something to eat. And so he made tents. And he talked about in Philippians, I've been hungry and I've had plenty. And both of them are fine with Jesus. It doesn't matter. Well, I'm here to tell you, I've been hungry and I've made good money, and I just as well make good money. Thank you. I'm not as spiritual as Paul. I didn't like being hungry. I didn't like being in need. But God, my favorite saying is this: God takes care of fools and children. And I've been both. God takes care of those who will do the work. And so he reasoned in the synagogue, verse 4. Every day he reasoned in the synagogue and persuaded Jews and Greeks every Sabbath. Verse 5, when Silas and Timothy had come from Macedonia, Paul was compelled by the Spirit and testified to the Jews that Jesus is the Christ. But when they opposed him and blasphemed, he shook his garments and said to them, your blood be on your own heads, for I am clean. From now on I'll go to the Gentiles. And he departed from there and entered the house of a certain man named Justus, one who worshipped God, whose house was next door to the synagogue. Then Crispus, the ruler of the synagogue, believed on the Lord with all of his household, and many of the Corinthians hearing believed and were baptized. Now when he says the ruler of the synagogue, he would have been the administrator of the synagogue. This was the guy who handled the funds, made sure that they had everything they need for worship, made sure that they had copies of the Scripture, paid the light bill, that sort of thing. He was the administrator. He was not the teacher. The ruler of the synagogue was not the rabbi. They had the rabbi who was there to take care of spiritual needs. They had the ruler of the synagogue whose job it was to take care of the physical needs of the church. And that's a pattern that we have pretty well copied in the church, and I'm really glad. I see the wisdom of God in the fact that through the years I didn't handle any money. I couldn't buy a postage stamp without permission. And that protected me from any temptation at all. Not that I can be tempted for the price of a postage stamp. It would take more than that. But I am human after all, right? But we're wise in the way that we separate that. And the elders appoint deacons to handle, and the ministers take care of the spiritual stuff. There is great wisdom in that. And having not one person kind of running the whole show. Because what happens when one person runs the whole show? Yeah, he gets his own way, and God may get his way every now and again. That's what happens. This is not wise. And we have followed that pattern in the church. Crispus, the ruler of the synagogue, was converted. That's a powerful thing. He would have been very well respected. Even though he was not a rabbi, he would have been very well respected in the synagogue. He would have been a key member of the synagogue. Many of the Corinthians hearing believed and were baptized. Now, it's interesting. Over in Corinth, Paul is going to say, well, I didn't baptize many of you. I can remember this guy, maybe there were one or two. And I've heard people say, see there, baptism's not that important. No, read the whole story. Many believed and were baptized. Paul just didn't personally do it. They had Timothy, he had Silas, he had Justus, who was a Gentile, but worshipped in the synagogue. He was a God-fearer. That is, he was not born Jewish. He was a Gentile who believed in God. Yes, brother.
There's somewhere it says that preaching and teaching the word is so important even though there's times of that.
Yes.
Rather than the actual baptizing of the individual. He needed to be teaching others. And he allowed those who were baptized to do that.
Does the Scripture teach that the preacher has to baptize? Does it ever say who has to baptize? It doesn't say, does it? I have seen many times where a couple or a family will come. Teenage kids, they'll come, they'll baptize the dad, then he baptizes the wife, the mom, and then he baptizes his own kids. I love it whenever a dad baptizes his own child. I think there's something special about it. And I have learned, I mentioned last week that I quit doing baptisms in India. Part of it was because the Hindus get all upset when they see a white guy, the American there, baptizing. Second reason is I think it creates a special connection when the local preacher baptizes people in his own village. They're going to see me maybe never again, maybe once in a lifetime. They're going to be worshiping with that preacher the rest of their lives. And so, the Scripture doesn't say. I baptized a guy from work one time. That was great. He came by my desk and said, "Hey, Brother Bill, I've been reading in my Bible about, and everybody I read about gets baptized, and I never have done that. Do you know anything about baptism?" And I said, "Why, yes, I do. Let's have lunch." And so we studied about it, and I gave him some scriptures, and a couple of weeks later, he asked me, "Would you not go home Friday night? Would you stay over and meet me at Lake Grapevine on Saturday because I want you to baptize me?" And I did. We baptized him in Lake Grapevine. About 6 months later, I performed a wedding ceremony for he and his fiancée. I did their wedding. And on their honeymoon, he baptized her in the hotel pool. Man, you see, you don't need any special qualifications. We practiced baptisms in the School of Preaching. We actually went in the water and practiced baptizing each other so we'd know how to do it. And it was good practice. But it doesn't matter who does the baptizing. What if you get the formula wrong? God knows. What if you don't get their hair all the way in the water? Will they be bald in heaven? No, it's an act of obedient faith. It's an act of submission and obedient faith and all the details. You want to get them right. I mean, for sure. But the Bible doesn't say who must do the baptizing. It just says you must submit to it. I always laugh about folks who say, "Well, baptism is a work." Really? What muscles do you use? All you're doing is just submitting to it. I just tell people, hold your nose and bend your knees. We're going in. And if it's a big guy, I'm going to tell him, when I get you down, I'm letting go and backing off. You're on your own. I have baptized a guy that was so big we overflowed the baptistry. He was big, and I'm big, and when I put him in the water, we displaced, the water went over into the auditorium. Yeah, it happens. But you see, Paul's saying, listen, don't make a big deal out of the fact that I baptized you. I baptized you into Christ. And that's what's important. Not the baptizer, but I baptized you into Christ. And you became part of Christ. You put on Christ. That's what matters. Doesn't matter who did the dipping. What matters is that you believed in Jesus so much that you did what he asked you to do. And he then blessed you for that. Verse 9. Now the Lord spoke to Paul in the night by a vision. Do not be afraid, but speak. And do not keep silent, for I am with you. And no one will attack you or hurt you. For I have many people in this city. And he continued there 1 year and 6 months, teaching the word of God among them. God told Paul, don't be afraid. Nobody's going to bother you. I've got work for you to do here. I'm going to protect you. Now, why would Paul be nervous? Well, they arrested and beat him in Philippi. They ran him out of town, out of Thessalonica. He got laughed out of Athens, pretty much. Not by everybody, but pretty much. And he goes down to Corinth, which is a wicked, wicked place. And he's preaching the gospel. I'd be nervous every time somebody spoke Greek around me. And God reassured him and said, don't be afraid. I have work for you to do in this place. It wasn't a comfortable place for Paul. Even moving from Troas into Philippi was a whole different change of culture. You have an Eastern culture and mindset and philosophy in Turkey, where Troas is, Ephesus, and those 7 churches. You got it's an Eastern philosophy. You step across that strait there between Troas and Philippi, all of a sudden you're in a Greek world, the Western philosophy. And it's different, and it's still different today. There's a world of difference between Greece and Turkey in the way they think and in their culture and in their historical background. It wasn't a comfortable place. And yet God used him in that place, a Jew, in Corinth. You know, I always was willing to go wherever God opened a door of opportunity. My first preaching job was in a little town called Kemp, Oklahoma. Had a population of 140. When we left there, we had 120 in worship on Sunday morning. And I went from there to downtown Dallas, right across the street from Fair Park in downtown East Dallas. You know that neighborhood that you lock your doors when you drive through? We stayed 8 years. It was an amazing work. God did amazing things there. And the congregation grew from about 80 to about 400. Well, then I got this idea that I wanted to go. I applied for a congregation in Berkeley, California. And I noticed that the further west we got, the bigger the salad bars got, and there is no chicken fried steak east of New Mexico. It doesn't exist. And so we stayed there about 3 days, and they realized pretty quick I didn't fit. And I realized pretty quick I didn't like this place. These people are weird. And we moved on. Well, I told you God protects fools and children, right? I wasn't that young when that happened. But yeah, it was not a culture where I would have been able to present the gospel well. I was born and raised in Texas. I was born at Fort Hood Army Hospital by Dr. Paul Revere. Not that one. Another one named Paul Revere. But this has been my home my whole life. And while God would have surely used my gift, and surely there would have been a lost guy from Texas somewhere in San Francisco. But Paul was in a very uncomfortable situation, and yet had a very fruitful ministry there. Lots of problems. You know why? Because lost people have lots of problems. That was one of the reasons we had a very effective ministry in the poorest part of Dallas. Because folks didn't have food to eat, and they couldn't pay their electric bill, and they couldn't take their kids to the doctor, and they couldn't pay their rent, and they had all kinds of bad habits that got them in the mess they were in. And the gospel worked powerfully there. They heard the gospel, and they repented of lots of behaviors. And it was so funny because we'd baptize people. We'd be paying their rent. They couldn't pay their rent. We'd get to know them. We'd teach them and baptize them. They'd be faithful, and they'd start growing. All of a sudden, they'd get a better job, and their kids would start doing better in school, and they'd get a decent car. Next thing you know, they'd move out to the suburbs and buy a house and become deacons in the congregation out in the suburbs. God just took them and blessed them and moved them on. Well, it was because the gospel is powerful and it changes people. And God used it effectively. That's what's going on in Corinth. Paul is teaching in a culture that did not have a godly background. And they could see how dark it was. One of the reasons that the gospel is being accepted in India right now the way it is because they've had 4,000 years of Hinduism, and it's brought them nothing but poverty and misery. It's divided up their whole culture. And it's done nothing to help their culture at all. And they see it. They realize it. That Hinduism has brought them nothing but poverty and misery. And they want something else. And the gospel shines very bright into that kind of environment. Now it says in verse 12, when Gallio was proconsul of Achaia, the Jews, with one accord, rose up against Paul, brought him to the judgment seat, saying, "This fellow persuades men to worship God contrary to the law." Now Gallio was a Roman governor. Proconsul would be equal to the rank of governor. And so the Jews bring Paul in and say, this guy's breaking the law. Well, were they talking about Jewish law or Roman law? Well, they probably were saying Roman law, but what they were really upset about was he was breaking Jewish law, or at least their traditions. And Gallio just didn't want to hear it. I mean, he just had a decree from Caesar kicking all the Jews out of Rome because Caesar was sick of all the fussing and all the trouble. And so now this comes up, and Gallio, Roman governor, said to the Jews, if it were a matter of wrongdoing or wicked crimes, O Jews, there would be reason that I should bear with you. But if it's a question of words and names and your own law, look to it yourselves. I don't want to be a judge of such matters. And he drove them from the judgment seat. Then all of the Greeks took Sosthenes, the ruler of the synagogue, and beat him before the judgment seat. But Gallio took no notice of these things. You remember the ruler of the synagogue that he got converted, Sosthenes? And then he got beaten. He was in the middle. He was on Paul's side. He was on the Jews' side, and they all turned on him. The Greeks beat him. Sosthenes is mentioned, by the way, in the book of 1 Corinthians. He's mentioned by name, Sosthenes. Gallio said, if this is a religion thing, don't bother me. You guys work it out. I don't care if Jesus is the Christ or not. It makes no difference to me. If it's a Roman law thing, then we need to talk. So Paul remained a good while, 18 months he stayed there. He remained a good while. Then he took leave of the brethren and set sail for Syria, Antioch of Syria. Remember, that was the church that sent him, Acts chapter 13. He was going back to his sending church to talk about what God had done. Priscilla and Aquila were with him. And he had his hair cut off at Cenchrea, for he had taken a vow. Wait a minute. That sounds suspiciously Jewish, doesn't it? He'd taken a vow, and at the end of the vow, he had his hair cut off. They shaved their head to signify they had fulfilled a vow. That's a Jewish thing. He's going to do it again in Acts chapter 21, by the way. There was the Nazirite vow had to do with not cutting your hair, but the Jewish custom was that if you took a vow, once you completed that vow, you shaved your head and gave a peace offering. And Paul was known to do that. Why? He was a Christian now. He wasn't under the law of Moses anymore. He was still Jewish. That was their custom. He was still Jewish. You know, I guess the most American thing you can eat is a hamburger. All right, a hot dog, maybe. But, you know, we eat hamburgers. I remember one time in Ghana, we had been in Ghana for several months, and we'd been eating lots of rice with a little bit of chicken in it, and we found a place that served American hamburgers with French fries. And I forgot what kind of Coke it was. Maybe it was actually Coca-Cola. Oh man, we ate us a hamburger in Ghana, West Africa. It was delicious. And the Ghanaian brethren said, do y'all eat that every day? No wonder you Americans are so fat. Yeah, they thought, well, that's their custom. You know, that's what they do. Paul was still a Jew. I mean, he didn't quit eating the Passover meal just because he was a Christian. He knew what it meant. They kept the festivals because he was still Jewish by culture, by birth. You know, when I'm in a foreign country on the 4th of July, I still celebrate Independence Day because I'm an American. It makes no difference. And so it's a mixture then of custom and tradition, not that he was still practicing the law of Moses. He came to Ephesus, verse 19, and left them there. He himself entered the synagogue and reasoned with the Jews. And when they asked him to stay a longer time with them, he did not consent. But he took leave of them, saying, I must by all means keep this coming feast in Jerusalem. Again, he's going for the Passover, the feast. He wants to keep it in Jerusalem this year. But I will return again to you, God willing, and he sailed from Ephesus. And when he landed at Caesarea and gone up and greeted the church, he went down to Antioch. Antioch was north of Caesarea, but it was downhill. He went down to Antioch, and after he had spent some time there, he departed and went over to the region of Galatia and Phrygia in order to strengthen all the disciples. And so he went back and reported, went back to Galatia and Phrygia. That's Iconium, Derbe, and Lystra from the first missionary journey. That's the area of Galatia. That's where Paul went back to the Christians he had seen and baptized on his first missionary journey. At some point during all of that, he wrote the book of Galatians to them during all of those journeys, saying, don't let people come in and try to teach you that you have to be circumcised in order to be a Christian. Don't let people try to teach you that you have to keep the law of Moses in order to be a Christian. And so he went back to visit the brethren. When the Jews from Thessalonica made accusation against Paul, their accusation was, he's teaching people they don't have to keep the law of Moses anymore. That was true. That was a true accusation. But when he was with Jewish people, he acted Jewish. Why? He said, I become all things to all men, that I may by all means save some. When I'm with the Jews, I'll act Jewish. When I'm with the Gentiles, I'll act Gentile. You know, one of the things that they do in India, they don't have a lot of capacity to wash things. They don't have hot water. And so they serve a lot of their meals on a banana leaf. And they'll put a banana leaf down, they put some rice, and they put some gravy on it, and you eat with your hands. Well, when I'm with my Indian brethren, I eat with my hands. Badly, by the way. They laugh. They say I eat like a 3-year-old. I always get it on my shirt and everywhere. But when I'm with them, I do that. I'm not about to do that down here at the steakhouse. Reach over there and pinch me off a piece and dip it in the gravy. Well, why? Because people think I was a barbarian. Didn't your mama teach you how to use a fork and knife? Well, yes, she did. I got quite a few whippings over that. And so I learned. When I'm with my brethren in India, I'm not going to ask for a spoon. Number one, they probably don't have one. And number two, who knows when it was the last time it was washed with soap and water. I've got exposed to tuberculosis in the mission field. I don't want to do that anymore. And so I'll eat with my hand. I can wash my hand. It's interesting, you also eat with your right hand. You never do anything with your left hand. You put it in your pocket. You don't touch anybody or any food with your left hand. You eat with your right. I guess there are no left-handed tennis players in India. I don't know. You don't use your left hand. You use your right hand. Custom. Over here, makes no difference. I have to catch myself. I'm always reaching up and patting somebody on the shoulder. You don't do that in India. Not with your left hand. And it's improper. It's improper for the men and the women to sit in the same section in the church building. Men sit on one side, women sit on the other side, children sit up front. There's a deacon over there with a big stick sitting by the children. And if they get to acting up, you're going to hear whack, and it'll get real quiet up there again. It's their custom. What would happen if one of the deacons whacked one of your grandkids one Sunday morning because he was acting up? We'd have to have a meeting. Yeah, that's the way they do it. It's different. Well, different customs. Well, how much time do I have? What time is it? I'm done, right? Well, I hate to give up next week, chapter 19, because chapter 19, the first part of Acts chapter 19, is what convinced me that I needed to be baptized. I had been baptized as a child in a religious group, and I thought I was fine until I read the first 8 verses of Acts chapter 19 and thought, uh-oh, I didn't do exactly what they did in the Bible. My baptism when I was 10, 12 years old, however old I was not like the one I read about in my Bible. and I better look at this again. And so I don't know who's teaching next week, honestly. But whoever's teaching next week, that's a powerful passage in my library, because it made a profound difference in my understanding of the New Testament. Let's bow for a word of prayer. Father, thanks for the day of worship. Thank you for the challenging message that Marcelino gave us. Thank you for these words of instruction. Thank you for Paul's courage, Father, that he didn't have a spirit of fear, but he had a spirit of power from you. Help us, Father, not to be afraid. Father, help us to be bold